Welcome back to Just Liberty, my friends, where liberty and justice meet. I'm Alan Reinach, president of the Church State Council, with my co-host Bettina Krause, editor of the oldest and best magazine in America, at least, probably the world, dedicated to religious liberty, called simply Liberty Magazine. And we're here today, the very interesting topic, because for the very first time, I think, in American history, we have a Religious Freedom Commission. I think it was appointed by the president. And so religious liberty, at least by title anyway, is, has a prominent seat at the government table in this current administration. And what are the implications of that? Is it a good thing for religious freedom? Is it a good thing for religious freedom for everybody or just for somebody? Well, let's bring on our guest. Bettina?
So we are absolutely delighted to have with us today Melissa Reid, who is an Associate Director of the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department at the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And, Melissa has a really interesting portfolio there. She advocates for the religious interests of the Adventist Church on Capitol Hill. And I cannot forget her most important title. She is also Associate Editor of Liberty Magazine and a very valued colleague. So welcome, Melissa.
Thank you so much. It is a true pleasure to be with you all.
So, Melissa, let's start with the basics here. What is this commission that Alan has just described? How did it come into being? How is it going about its work?
Sure. Well, Alan was exactly right. It is the first of its kind. It's known as the Religious Liberty Commission, and it actually came into fruition through an executive order, which was issued in May of 2025. So it's chaired by the Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who is very seasoned in the space of religious freedom, and then vice chair is Dr. Ben Carson. And the executive order houses the commission under the Department of Justice. And it's very simply, its directive is to advise the White House Faith Office and Domestic Policy Council on religious liberty policies of the United States. And so they are having a series of hearings. I just recently had the opportunity of attending the second of the hearing. I was able to attend the first as well. But from those hearings, they're going to be producing a comprehensive report that will recommend steps to secure religious liberty, identify any challenges and opportunities to further the cause of religious liberty around the world.
And so I guess one of the questions is just whether the commission adequately represents the diversity of religious voices in this country. Obviously, we may not think about it that much, but beyond the sort of dominant religious communities, that we know of, there are just an enormous number of, relative minorities that have very unique challenges, right? Just as one example, the Sikh community, which is, indigenous to the country of India, the men wear turbans, they wear beards, they even have a practice of a ceremonial dagger, which has been accommodated at times and not accommodated at times, but they have a great tradition of military and law enforcement service, and they have wanted to serve in those capacities in this country, and there have been all kinds of challenges. That's just, one community that we're familiar with. There's so many others that have their very unique religious beliefs and practices. Talk to us about the diversity of the commission and, its its sort of attitude or ethos when it comes to not just religious liberty concerns of, dominant faiths, but the minority faiths.
Right. Well, you both have worked in this space for many years now, and what you're describing, Alan, has sort of been the status quo of recognizing that minority faith perspectives have really been the ones needing to have those safeguards, to have those protections. That's true of any minority population, right? When we talk about rights and freedoms. And this body is unique. And I think there's, been valid criticism about the makeup of the body. It is by and large very Christian oriented, both representation as far as Protestant and Catholic. There is some advisors that are Jewish, and I believe there's one that is a Muslim individual as well. But I mean, I think that's consistent. This is different than the meetings that I usually attend that deal with religious liberty work down on the Hill, because this is part of an administration, right? A federal administration, and so there is very much a an agenda in the way, and it very much is coming from the perspective of um, a majority faith, right? You're now seeing a majority faith in a country saying, feeling threatened, as they see the rise of secularism and things like that in the country. And so it is very much wanting to preserve the identity and heritage and freedoms of a favored religion, something of a religion that has been well, maybe it hasn't been favored in the past, but it has been the dominant religion, right, as far as Christianity. So the very first meeting that took place, the very first hearing, was talking about the foundations of religious liberty in America. And it was really interesting to me because there seemed, from my perspective, to be some revisionist history as far as what the intents of our founding fathers were, as far as preserving religious freedom, very much going into the wanting America to be a Christian nation sort of state. So in yesterday's meeting with the that dealt with religious liberty in the educational public school system, specifically for parents and students there, we really saw a nod towards what we would think of as sort of traditional religious liberty, separation of church and state history, a nod towards maybe not a enthusiastic embrace of. So that was interesting. But yesterday, as far as going back to the representation of the various perspectives, we did hear from an Orthodox Christian parent, as well as a representative from a Jewish religious freedom organization. But by and large, the conversation was about the challenges that Christians are facing as far as religious freedom here in the United States.
So, Melissa, as you're attending these events, and you've attended two now, there's been two meetings of the commission. Give us a sense of the flavor of the occasion. I mean, are you getting the feeling that this is a work of maybe posturing, maybe putting forward a certain agenda or a point of view, or is this a sort of a working group that is substantively engaged in sifting through material and coming to conclusions? So is it a working group, or is it more of a communication exercise?
Sure. I think that it's definitely the latter. There definitely is a dominant perspective that is illustrated both in the members of the commission and those that are are testifying, right, to the commission. And there's definitely an agenda, right? There again, like I said, I think that there is a belief among Christians that they're they're losing their rights and their freedoms. They're feeling vulnerable. They feel like their country is being taken from them, and so a lot of conversation, talking, really sort of um, how can we move away from that? How can we as I said, sort of get our country back. And I will say that, so yesterday the topic was on, as I said, education, religious freedom in the public school system. And there was testimony from both parents and young students talking about challenges that they had as far as religious freedom in their public school system, and they were very sympathetic, and I certainly agreed with them as far as there was a young girl that during the pandemic when she was attending school, she wanted to wear a face mask that said Jesus loves me on it, and she was disciplined for that, even though there was all kinds of other language, whether it was sports teams or other sort of popular sayings or things like that that were allowed in her thing. There was a young man who was the high school valedictorian, and during his speech, he submitted his speech in advance. In the speech, he acknowledged that Jesus Christ was his personal savior, and he was asked to remove that portion from the speech, which he did not. And he described it as, my Christianity isn't part of who I am. It is who I am, and I can identify that. And I think, again, from a parental perspective, that's certainly not something that, parents want to stymie in their children, is, this importance of Christ as their savior. And there was another situation where a young brother and sister wanted to participate in a talent show and submitted a Christian song, and were told that there were, quote, too many Jesuses in the lyrics. And I don't know. We weren't able to land on how many Jesuses were appropriate
Right.
and then there was a young person from your state, Alan, from your home state of California, who was made to participate in gender ideology curriculum that was really counter to his family's religious beliefs. There was no opt-out portion. And so I was very sympathetic to this perspective as far as,
Right. But it sounds like it was very one-sided, right?
It was very one-sided,
So
correct.
two observations, and I'll keep them brief. So first, and this, I mean, I've been at this a very long time, going back to the 1960s when the Supreme Court said, that public schools can't be, tip the scales in favor of religion, can't have devotional Bible readings and prayers in the public schools. The reaction from the Christian community was to be shocked and to say, oh my, the Supreme Court kicked God and religion out of public schools. Now, instead of, working with the situation for positive things, what happened was the message was, oh, well, Jesus and God and religion and gospel music and all of this is not allowed in public school. And it became such a battleground that principals, school leaders, whether they were hostile to religion or not, they want to keep the peace. And they began to believe the message from the Christian community, even though it was wrong, even though, the Supreme Court affirmed the role of the Bible in education, that the Bible is a critical piece of our civilization and should be read in public schools, right? So that's one piece of it. Yes, all of those stories, and there's so many more. And our organization is prepared to litigate those cases as they come to us, because they're valid. But I want to one more piece of this. The very first interfaith program that I participated in back in the mid-90s at the Carmichael Seventh-day Adventist Church in Sacramento. And we had about a dozen different faith leaders on the panel, and there was a Muslim mother who told the story of her elementary school child coming home from public school in December and asking for a Christmas tree. Okay. Christmas was so much a part of the public school during December that, of course, this little girl felt the excitement, and she wanted to participate in all of this excitement about Jesus and his birth and a Christmas tree from a Muslim family. And So here we have all these stories about, how Christians feel excluded, but it's one-sided because after all, our culture still is predominantly Christian in orientation, and there's so many other stories out there that we're not hearing.
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head, and I do want to affirm um, uh, some of the goals or perspectives of or initiatives of the commission. So, as far as there really is that need of awareness, what are your rights, right? I know that you do, know your rights seminars or in other areas of the law, right? What are your rights as a student? What are your rights as a parent? And I think um, and also educating schools and school administrators and teachers, right? Because again, I think most of the time in these situations there's not malice. Sometimes there is, unfortunately, on the part of the teacher or the administrator, but they really are believing that they're doing what they're supposed to do as far as and that was an interesting conversation on part of a conversation yesterday was like, what is the difference? Is there a difference and between neutrality and secularism? And I think that we're seeing schools, particularly in some jurisdictions, moving towards secularism as as neutrality. And I think that those are two very different things. Secularism is an ideology, but as far as the guidance and the need for that, so actually, President Trump spoke in the morning of the second session that I attended. He spoke for quite a while, and he actually announced that the Department of Education is soon going to be issuing guidance about protecting the right to prayer, specifically in public schools. Um, I think I applaud that. I think there's the right for, and that was another young person. It was a story that mentioned as she wanted to simply pray with her friends. A classmate of theirs had just passed away, and she was disciplined for that, wanting to do that. So I think guidance is always appropriate. I think it's always helpful. And so to that point that you made, Alan, I think that I was encouraged by that announcement. The guidelines have not come out yet, but I think I applaud the idea of making sure that our nation is a place that, while recognizing the need for that separation between these two distinct spheres, is not doing it to the detriment of the right of people of faith to be able to pray or to worship or things like that.
But of course, these issues are so nuanced, they're so complex, they're so subjective that, it makes me a little fearful, I guess, as to what guidance will be forthcoming on issues of prayer in public school. I don't know if you saw recently a press release from Attorney General Paxton's office of Texas on prayer in Texas public schools, where there was recent legislation allowing schools to set aside time for, I'm not sure the wording, but it was prayer or contemplation or something of that nature. And the press release suggested that perhaps the Lord's Prayer would be appropriate, and helpfully quoted the Lord's Prayer in its entirety in the press release. What we have here is a clear indication that these issues, while we may be able to identify clear principles, when it comes to actually applying those principles,
Yeah.
there's a huge gulf between people's expectations and desires, right?
Oh, I think exactly right. And, I think, as I mentioned, before, the chair of this commission is the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, which has passed legislatively, uh, has been very deliberate in passing legislation to be able to make legal things that you're talking about, this prayer time, mandatory prayer time, or being able to or the posting of the 10 commandments. And again, you're talking about, well, what would that prayer look like? Just posting the 10 commandments. We've had those conversations many times about, that's favoring one particular perspective, right? One particular faith tradition and its laws. And so I think you're right, Bettina, that we probably can are happy to see the desire to protect the right of people to act out their faith, but will it come at the expense of minority faiths? Will it come with a favoritism of a particular way of worshiping a particular type of or faith tradition, things like that? So I think that I think that we, as you pointed to Texas, I think that we can see that in fact it will.
So I think we have to put this discussion in a broader context of civil rights. And, because, of course, this administration has taken a sledgehammer to the whole concept of civil rights protections, for example, on the basis of race, and the whole movement that has become kind of a dirty word now, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the places that I see this in my sphere is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is the agency that processes civil rights complaints of race discrimination, employment discrimination, right? And I follow the statistics carefully. And typically, religious discrimination is approximately anywhere between 2 and 4% of the total discrimination complaints. Race is a big one, gender's a big one, retaliation's a big one, right? Harassment's a big one. But this EEOC has set as an enforcement priority dealing with the smallest segment of their, volume of complaints, which is religion. So I had one investigator tell me, "Oh, your complaint, falls right in our enforcement priorities." And I'm like, "Oh, well, I guess good, good for my client, but um, and I just had to, kind of laugh because of course, what about all of the others who are treated so badly and these other categories of folks? So it seems as though this administration is really prioritizing promoting religion and emphasizing discrimination against Christians as opposed to anybody else that who's suffering and discrimination, oppression might be as bad or worse and much more deeply entrenched in our culture.
So I agree with you for the most part. When I talked about the executive order creating this commission, we know that there were also within the same sphere executive orders creating a task force to root out anti-Christian bias in the federal workplace and workforce, right? And we also know that there was an executive order to root out anti-Semitism. And so I think those two, and from the uh, participants, the witnesses that I've seen participating, there has been, I think, a good amount of time spent on anti-Semitism as well. But your point as far as highlighting religious freedom, as far as protected classes, I think that's a valid one for sure.
It's so interesting because each administration brings its own priorities into its enforcement of, through its various agencies. And each administration brings its own definition of religious freedom. I remember under the Biden administration, that understanding of religious freedom also came with certain concerns, certain caveats attached, because it didn't give much credence to things like religious exemptions from neutrally applicable general laws. This administration is sort of swinging the pendulum in another direction. And I guess in a way, Melissa, it's the role of yourself as an advocate in this area to sort of point out the excesses on both ends of the spectrum, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's your role. It's everyone's role, right? As far as a citizen. But yeah, you're exactly right. I think we're seeing again sort of two competing ideologies. We talk about this all the time. Sort of And it's a winner takes all approach, right? We're no longer in that time period of respecting a diversity of perspectives. It's very much this is our agenda, and this is our goals, and um, you know that's what we're going to focus on, and the priority is not so much there's not a conversation. Well, sometimes I don't know, I'm thinking about on the state level where I see um maybe an outright hostility to the other perspective. Maybe we see that in federal government as well too. But I think it is the role of us as representatives of faith traditions, of representative of civil rights protections, that we do speak up. And first of all, we say welcome, right, to this conversation, because it's been a part of our conversation since the inception of the Seventh Day Adventist Church, my faith tradition, and the organization that I represent, because we have that minority perspective. And so while we are very pleased to see the desire for the administration to prioritize religious freedom, it certainly should not mean a favoring of one belief system over the other. And so, yeah, I think that that's our role, is to be that watchdog, and to be that balance. But it's interesting, I mentioned President Trump was there and spoke for quite some time to the commission. And he said some things that I really agreed with, as far as, that we need to restore our identity as a nation under God. And I very much believe that my rights and my freedoms are because my creator has bestowed them on me, right? They're not, the law affirms them, the national laws affirm them. But it was good, particularly when I've seen what I think is maybe some overreaching or some heavy-handedness from this administration, as far as that there was an acknowledgement that in fact these freedoms are something that are bestowed upon us from God. And another comment that he made that I'll just say I was surprised and pleasantly surprised to hear, is that he said that when faith gets weaker in a country, the country itself seems to weaken. And one of the other initiatives that he launched was this America Prays initiative, which, as you know, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and there's all kinds of different initiatives and activities and celebrations that are planned for that. But this America Prays initiative of the administration is inviting faith communities here in the United States to pray specifically for our nation and our leaders, and for peace in the world. And again, I applaud that. Our office host an annual prayer breakfast, and one of the prayers that we pray every time is for our nation and our leaders. I think we're called to do that. I think that's a biblical call to do that. So I appreciate that there very much is the desire for religion and faith to be welcome. I think that there's a greater opportunity for that to be a welcoming of more, maybe sort of a more pluralistic view of faith.
Well, the irony to me is that as a historical reality, the more the state embraces and promotes religion, the weaker religion becomes. And so while this administration seems to be embracing and promoting religion in ways that, at least the rhetoric and the goals may seem positive to us, it may actually be counterproductive. But Bettina, you drafted some lovely questions, to kind of help us think about this interview. And one of them, I think we might want to ask virtually all of our guests as a closing question. And it is that for those who are listening today, and presumably if they've gotten to this point of a show about religious liberty, they actually care about religious freedom, right? They have a sufficient interest. And the question is, what can our listeners do to stay informed and get involved? And, my motto when I was doing Freedom's Ring, which you were on many times over the years, was, be informed, get involved. So how do we do that? Any closing thoughts for our listeners?
Yeah. Well, so this commission is open to the public to both view. It's streamed online, each of the hearings. Again, it's part of the Justice Department. So if you go to the Justice Department website, they have links for you to sign up to be able to attend. And it's first come, first serve. And then, of course, there's the live stream, and it's available afterwards. We talked about the education component, and much like we want to educate our teachers and our school administrators, we need to educate ourselves, because again, I think we do hear one version of what is religious freedom, what should that look like, and asking these questions about, well, what about this perspective though, and what about that? I think having additional voices, additional perspectives always is a good idea. And so I think it's great for us to both see what our federal government is doing, what it's up to, and then sort of asking those questions to ourselves, as far as, does this make sense to me? Where do I think that they could improve? Things like that. So one thing I was going to say, Alan, is the very next session. So this one was on the parental and student rights as far as religious freedoms goes. The next hearing that's scheduled is going to be dealing with the religious freedom rights of teachers and coaches. We think of the Coach Bremerton case, right? And the ability to pray. And then also beyond that, there's going to that the next one is going to deal with school funding and educational choice. And I think that's going to be a really, we saw with just the recent passage of the Big Beautiful Bill, right? That there was a provision in there that created a national school choice program by offering federal tax credits. So they were able to, or they're hoping to be able to, avoid the restrictions on direct federal aid to religious schools by creating these tax credits instead. And so I would encourage, going back to what can we do, I would encourage listeners or viewers to tune into this next session and see what this conversation about school funding and educational choice would look like, and if it's something that you feel makes sense in a country that I still believe values that separation of church and state.
Well, Melissa, thank you so much for your insights. It was almost as good as being there ourselves. And I'm pretty sure we're going to have some more conversations in the future about the work of the commission. It sounds like it is something that we need to keep our eyes on. So thank you for being with us.
It was a pleasure. Thanks.
So what I got from our conversation with Melissa, Alan, was that religious liberty in America today is a contested issue. The definition of religious liberty is contested. I mean, clearly this Religious Liberty Commission is coming at religious liberty from a certain perspective, that religious liberty means the right to shape America as a predominantly Christian nation. Did you get that sense?
I did. And, I have seen it historically as the struggle between the Puritan idea and, frankly, the American idea, the idea of our founding fathers, because, the Puritan experiment in Massachusetts fell apart. Originally, only church members could vote, right? But as the community grew, and in order to be a church member, you had to be able to give a, confession of your faith that you'd been, born again and whatever, that you were converted. So more and more members of the community were not enrolled in the church as members, but they still had to attend church, of course, and they lost the vote. Well, that was an untenable situation. They had what was called the halfway covenant. So they would have, I guess, a form of membership that would entitle them to vote, right? And the whole thing kind of blew apart. Well, after the First Great Awakening, you had an explosion of congregations that were not from the dominant established churches. So in Virginia, the Anglican Church was
Yes.
established, but you had Presbyterians, you had Methodists, you had Baptists, you know, um, all kinds of evangelical fervor, and it no longer became tenable to try to have a single established church.
Hmm.
Uh, and you have these tensions, but we've always had the what I call the Puritan Party, the National Reform Movement at the time
Yes.
the Adventist Church came about, and the Adventists were the foremost opponents of this Puritan approach to religion in America, to the National Reform Movement that wanted to declare America a Christian nation. And we've always seen that as the antithesis of religious freedom.
Right. And we see with the Constitution, Article 6, right? No religious tests. Our founders explicitly rejected that Puritan ideal or idea of what America was, a Christian
Right.
nation.
And ironically, it wasn't until I want to say 1960, Torquazo versus Watkins, when a case involving a religious test went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme
Is
Court
that
said
right?
no.
Isn't that interesting? I had not heard of that case. I'm going to look that one up.
Uh, I'm going to check real quick while we're talking and make sure I've got the year right.
Well, I mean, religious
61. I
60.
wasn't sure. It was 60 or 61, but it's 61.
Well, that's fascinating that it took so long to get to the Supreme Court. But I mean, the point was that right at the very beginning, a conscious choice was made as to what this new republic was going to be, what nature it would have. And the conscious choice was made to reject religious tests. And at the time, Alan, that was seen by some as somewhat scandalous. The idea that there would be no religious tests, that was seen as something dangerous, right there, out there on the edge, something that hadn't been done before.
Right. Imagine, a Muslim or a
Right.
Jew or a Quaker,
A
or
quake.
a
Oh, yeah,
Catholic, Maryland was Catholic, but
yeah,
in New England, that would have been
yeah,
um, tough stuff.
yeah.
But Roger Williams, founder of Rhode Island back in the 1640s, wrote a parable about a ship. And on board, you had people of all these different religions, Catholics and Jews and Muslims and Quakers, and everybody, as long as they did their job on the ship, they had the freedom to worship. And
Huh.
that was his, model of religious freedom is, we're citizens here and we have to uphold our obligations as part of the community, but we have the right to our religious beliefs and practices. And that really was the philosophical
Yes.
and theological model of our nation.
And interestingly, Alan, we're still fighting about it. Centuries later, we're still arguing about what the nature of America is, what our central identity is. So,
Well, it strikes me our Adventist understanding in the book of Revelation is that the United States is pictured in chapter 13 as the second beast that is caught, if you will, between the lamb and the dragon. And there's this tug of war going on between the lamb with its two horns that are Christ-like because we protect civil and religious freedom. We have the separation of powers that protects against tyranny, but then, we speak as a dragon.
hmm,
And, any sort of sensible assessment of American history, has to recognize both the aspirational principles of freedom and equality and the wonderful values of our Declaration of Independence and our whole system, which has, just really been transformative globally in terms of values.
Yes.
And yet, the reality has fallen so far short in so many ways. We don't need to dwell on that.
No. Which is why we will always have more material to discuss on Just Liberty, right?
Okay, so I hear a close coming, Bettina.
So on that note, thank you all for joining us again for Just Liberty. I'm Bettina Krause with Alan Reinach. And remember, until next time, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. So be informed, get involved.